So, Crash Team Racing. What can I say? That's probably one of the best kart racers I've ever played. When I was a young lad, I got Crash Team Racing for Christmas. Thought it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. However, does it still hold up? Even after all these years? Crash Team Racing was developed in 1999 by Naughty Dog and was the final Crash Bandicoot game that they worked on. Overall, it received positive critical reception according to Metacritic, receiving an 88 from Metacritic respectively. However, it rightfully so deserves this kind of praise, considering that CTR is not only one of the most polished car racing games I've ever played, but it is also quite possibly the best Crash Bandicoot game I've ever played. And that's no discrediting the vastness of Crash Bandicoot Warped. I guess the most natural way to proceed is to talk about the story. The story opens with the alien Oxide challenging other racers on Earth to see who's the fastest. If they lose, he threatens to turn the entire planet into a parking lot. Without further ado, Crash and crew need to race in order to save the planet Earth. The purpose of the plot is to give a form of a basis for the game. In this case, the player always gets reminded what they are fighting against. Every time you drive by Oxide's spaceship, you always feel his presence, like he's there even when he does not show up. With this constant reminding of the threat that is hovering above you, the game does a very good job of creating stakes for the player to care about what's going on. For instance, many of the bosses, before you fight them, will have some kind of exposition explaining how you're not fit enough to race against Oxide. It's this kind of reminding of the villain's presence that the antagonist manages to create some kind of being in the story even though he doesn't show up that often. However, because the story only seems as a setup to draw the player in, the most important aspect is the gameplay. Since the story is not too involved, gameplay takes up the majority of it. The thing I like about CTR is the amount of content the game gives you to do. The game is simply plain racing, it actually would get very boring. CTR keeps you engaged by introducing the concept of other items outside the standard trophies to keep itself fresh. One of these is the CTR tokens, which requires that you collect the letters C, T, and R while still managing to reach first place. This forces you to find shortcuts in case one of the letters is hidden in there. It forces familiarity with the track. Then there are the timed relic races. In order to achieve these, you need to finish the race in the allotted time. There are 3 types of relics: Sapphire, Gold, and Platinum. However, you only need the Sapphires to go 100%. Scattered around the track are several time crates to slow down time. This forces some kind of test of how fast you can make it across the finish line. That's one of the good things about CTR. It has a very substantial adventure mode to it to compensate for the multiplayer mode. So that means that the single player mode features aspects that other games also feature, such as boss fights and various collectibles. Boss fights in this game are actually kind of a mixed bag because once you get ahead of them, they're as easy as pie. The reason for this has a lot to do with the fact that their main attacks will only hit you from behind, as long as you're behind them. And this sometimes makes the bosses kind of easy. Dude, Ripperoo, Pinstripe, Komodo Joe, and Papu Papu. All of them play the same, and you race against them in their respective stages, and they'll throw things like exploding bombs behind them or TNT crates or nitro crates, and it's only from behind, because once you get in front, like I said, it's a cakewalk. It also features a lot of extra collectibles beyond the main collectibles. For instance, after you collect all the CTR tokens from the main tracks, you'll get to unlock the gem cups in Gemstone Valley. These gems, for the most part, are a lot different compared to the normal races because they're done in a very tournament-esque style where you race in 4 different tracks and you accumulate points, and the person that accumulates the most amount of points is the one that wins the cup and ultimately achieves the gem. And these races are overall, I thought, was the highlight of the adventure mode in CTR, and it makes gathering the tokens a well worth achievement. This is sort of another thing that I like about CTR, because it actually makes the collectibles be important and integral to unlocking even bigger degrees of collectibles hidden throughout the game. Probably the next best thing in CTR is the racing mechanics themselves. So CTR introduces the concept of drift boosting, meaning that you can reach a combo of boosts by sliding and pressing R1. This allows for more speed across the track than when you are normally driving. This is where the real skill of CTR really becomes apparent, because it forces you to match the correct timing of when to boost in the middle of a drift. It's great. It really spices up the racing for me because it makes it all the more technical. However, most of the races can be beaten without using this mechanic, so there's something there for the serious and the casual player. If you want to reach 100% and get all those timed rocks, speed is of the essence, and this mechanic becomes useful. The challenge comes with drifting at the right time without hitting a wall, hitting the R1 button with the correct timing. This is also seen with when you're about to start up a race. Do you just simply go when the green light occurs, or do you try to charge up the meter at the bottom right of the screen and force yourself to have a boost, which gives you a vantage point in the game? Overall, I like these subtle technical aspects, and whether you take advantage of the drift boost mechanic really can sometimes depend on whether you win the race or not. However, CTR has a lot of flaws that prevent it from being truly good. And these flaws are really minute and they don't really affect the game too much. However, I do feel that there has to be some kind of problems in every game that prevents it from being perfect or anything like that. So what I notice is that there's at least one racer that seems to pull ahead every single time during a race. This is especially seen during the Gem Cups. When I was playing as Pura, I noticed that Tiny seems to pull ahead all the other racers every single time, no matter how hard I tried to subdue him and prevent him from reaching ahead. For whatever reason, he always seemed to be in first place, and constantly I found when I was fighting to remain in that position, first place for, honestly, for all of the Gem Cups, and I just found that to be really baffling how one racer seemed to dominate almost every single time. It's a little strange for the AI balancing of this game. And there's like the structure of the track. And sometimes the power slide, as good of a mechanic as it is, sometimes causes the driver to meander too close to the wall, and it forces the player to make incomplete boosts. For instance, when I was playing in Hot Air Speedway, that track is designed to have a lot of twists and turns. Sometimes, despite the fact that Pura is very manageable when it comes to turning compared to some of the other characters, He will slide a little too far and sometimes overshoot a slide, which will cause him to lose control and slide a little too far and eventually fall into the abyss. And it will force me to not make a full slide combo. Now, granted, if this were the case, then maybe the game would be a little unbalanced if you could just do complete three slide combos in with every track. However, sometimes it does get to some frustration, and even in tracks like Ruse Tubes, I found it very difficult to pull off power slides because sometimes I find myself running too close to the wall and getting kind of stuck there, and which prevented me from performing perfected power slides across the track. It kind of goes into my other point, where depending on the character's stats, they might perform differently depending on the track that they are in. So, considering that I was playing as Pura, he was really good at turning, so that made him very good at levels like Oxide Station. However, since he was slow, he couldn't quite reach the same he had the same capacity of Tiny Tiger or Dingodile, and sometimes it made him very difficult for me to reach first place in a couple of tracks. It also almost makes it mandatory to pick up some of the question mark mystery boxes to gain a weapon in order to shoot an opponent and reach first place. This isn't necessarily a problem, but when you're playing through adventure mode, it could be an issue because certain characters might not be good at turning, and there might be some tracks that require a good sense of maneuverability. However, it wouldn't really. Some of the characters don't have what it takes to reach some capacity that some of the tracks might be offering, and so that could kind of pose as an issue for the adventure mode campaign. Now the trophies and relics, you finally get to race Nitrous Oxide. He's probably the fastest boss in the game, throws everything at you, including exploding TNTs and nitro crates, and red and green beakers and everything, and he's also the fastest. However, once you get in front of him, he's really no problem. So after you finally beat him, he goes back to his ship and declares that he's going to leave you alone, and he decides that he's returning to his planet Gasmoxia and will never terrorize Earth again. So there you have it, folks. And that was it. That was CTR. Towards the end of the game, the credits roll, and you get to see a lot of where they are now with many of the characters. My favorite one is Pura because he apparently eats one of the stage performer's heads off when he becomes a tiger in the circus. And I think that's really interesting because just look at how cute Pura is. Furthermore, as an even bigger bonus, you do get to see footage of the development cycle that Naughty Dog went through with all 4 Crash Bandicoot games. I feel like this was such a good feature because it displayed how Crash Team Racing feels well like a celebration of Naughty Dog's final moments with the Crash Bandicoot series. So, yeah, they're sort of displaying all the work that they've done with this series and how it should be celebrated. Along with the adventure mode, there also comes the arcade mode in CTR. Now for the arcade mode, you can play as either single player or multiplayer. I play with single player, of course, because I'm a twat with no friends. And ultimately, you're introduced to choose a character from the roster to race as. Now this is a good connection between adventure mode and arcade mode because every time that you win a gem cup in CTR, you're able to unlock a character from one of the bosses. These include Ripperoo, Papu Papu, Komodo Joe, and Pinstripe. However, there are some other characters that you can unlock. You can unlock Penta Penguin by typing in this code, and you can unlock Entropy through beating all of his ghosts. And yeah, this ultimately gives a very substantial sort of connection with adventure and arcade mode. Plus, you can race in cups or a single track, depending on what your preference is. The cups are very similar to the gem cups in adventure mode, and you can choose from between 3 to 7 laps. Ultimately, I find that this mode, even in single player, feels very substantial in its content. Well, I find CTR to be one of the best Crash games that you'll ever get. Considering it was the final entry to Crash Bandicoot series, it was probably Naughty Dog really released it with a huge flair, and considering that I think Crash 3 is probably my favorite, you understand where people are coming from when they say CTR is their favorite. While the racing mechanics are really solid, the presentation makes it feel like a Crash game. And it really belongs in Crash. That if you took away some aspects, such as the Crash characters, it wouldn't feel like a game. Therefore, it really does present itself as a Crash game. The controls are top notch, and the slide boost system is one of the best in kart racing history. Therefore, I highly recommend the CTR. And despite some minor issues, such as strange malfunctions with the character AI, tending to pick on you, or some of the track design making it have you slide around tight turns, I overall thoroughly recommend CTR Crash Team Racing, and it's definitely worth the buy in the end.